Every Man an Enemy, Chapter 14. Tinker and Kirby had gone. They'd been called back to the library by Inspector Trooper. Now Blake was alone in the lounge, thoughtful, gnawing his lip as he paced the floor. He had a curious feeling. It was the feeling that he knew something vital, and yet didn't know it. It was the feeling that, within his mind, unrecognized at this moment, there were tiny fragments of information which, pieced together, would clear up a very considerable part of this case. But what were they? Were they things he'd seen? Were they things he'd heard? He shook his head bemusedly. Had they come to him very recently or a long time before? He didn't know. What were they? He must think very carefully. Then one came close to the surface of his mind, so close that Blake swore as it eluded his grasp. He must try again. He must try harder. Then he had it. 1, 2, 3, the scraps of talk came back to him. 1, 2, 3, they clicked into place like jigsaw pieces. Now Blake knew. What he knew startled him. Impulsively, he swung around and went quickly out of the lounge. He could hear voices from the direction of the library, and he said to a constable standing in the hall near the front door, "They're all still in there?" As he spoke, he indicated the library with a nod of his head. "Yes, sir." The constable's answer was respectful. Like his chief, he had heard of Blake and envied him his reputation. "All in there?" Blake repeated, laying special emphasis on the first word. "All." Blake nodded then, satisfied. He mounted the stairs to the first floor of the house and the guest bedrooms. If what he had just worked out in his mind was correct, he should, somehow, be able to prove it. Somewhere, in one of the guests' bedrooms, he should find the proof that he needed. Carla Scott left the study after being sternly questioned by Inspector Trooper. She closed the door none too gently behind her. Tight lines of strain were showing round her mouth and her eyes. She went down the hall quickly and ran up the stairs to her room. Inside her mind, the thoughts were going round and round and round like rats in a cage. She blundered against the door of her room. She dropped her hand, fastened it round the knob, and drew the door open. She went in quickly. She was in the room, halfway across it, before she suddenly realized that she was not alone there. Sexton Blake was there, waiting for her. She said, half incredulously, half angrily, "What on earth are you doing here? This is my room." "I know it, Carla." "Then what—" "Don't you know what I'm doing here?" Blake said quietly. "Do you really have to ask?" Her eyes fixed on his, and then jerked away, frightened at what they saw there. He knew. Blake knew. Her eyes swung round desperately as though seeking a way of escape, but there was none. Blake had moved to block off the door. "We're going to have to bring this thing out into the open sooner or later," he said, and his voice was grim. "We're going to bring it out into the open now." "I don't know what you mean. I don't know what you're talking about." Carla's voice was high-pitched. The words gabbled out of her. Blake frightened her. What he knew frightened her. What he could tell John Bovis frightened her most of all. "Do you want me to tell John?" It was almost as though Blake could read her mind. "Do you want me to tell him, or are we going to talk about this thing, you and I? Are you going to tell me the truth?" "I don't know what you mean," Carla said again, but her voice was weaker now, her denial less vehement. Her face was white, her violent blue eyes were haunted. "What?" "What would I tell him? I'd tell him everything." Blake spoke, flatly, uncompromisingly. "I will, never doubt it, if you force me to." He paused, and his mouth was a hard line. Then, "I'll tell him something that you've been hiding from him, something that you've been hiding from all of us," he said, and he stared at her. "I'll tell him that you, Carla Scott, are the missing author, MacDonald Hall." Carla made to deny it, but Blake interrupted. "Don't waste my time. I'm not to be fooled any more. I know what I'm talking about. You hear me? I know." She went to pieces then. She began to sob, choking on tears, hiding her face from him, unable to speak. With sudden compassion in his eyes, Blake moved to rest a hand on her shoulder. He said gently, "You're going to have to tell me everything you know. You must." She looked at him then, her red lips quivering. "I'll tell you," she said. She fought for control over herself, and she won. She drew a deep, trembling breath. "Could I have a cigarette?" Blake gave her one and lit it for her. He lit one for himself. He said, "You've kept this from John Bovis because you love him and want to marry him. Is that right?" She said bitterly, "It must sound crazy. I'm MacDonald Hall and I don't want to be. And there are those men down there in the library, Asprey and Prout, a fine pair of frauds who'd give their eye teeth to be in my shoes." "Someone's killed 3 times to get into those shoes," Blake said grimly, "and he may kill again. I want the whole story. Everything. Now." She sighed, wearily. "You must know it. You already know I love John. And you already know that he would never marry another writer. Not again. Not after his last marriage. That's crazy too, but he's made it plain enough. He really means it." Once more, she was close to tears, but she shook them away defiantly. "What else could I do but what I did? I've loved John for a very long time." She dragged on her cigarette. She sat down on the bed. She said, "I've known John for about 3 years. I've worked for him for most of that time. When I first went to work for him, it had just happened, you know, his divorce. He felt very badly about it. He tried not to show it, but it hurt him. Deeply. He didn't understand what had happened. He felt lost," Blake said. "I know. Perhaps that's why he adopted the attitude that he did. He blamed his wife for everything, and not only his wife as a woman, he blamed her as a writer as well. He thought that if she hadn't been an authoress, the marriage wouldn't have broken up." Blake shrugged, but didn't say anything. Carla went on. "Anyway, that's what he thought, and it's what he thinks today, and too, so nothing has changed." She drew on her cigarette again, and then, abruptly, she stubbed it out. She said, "It didn't matter at first. I wasn't in love with John when I first went to work for him. That came later. I didn't want to fall in love with him. It just happened. I didn't go out of my way to make it happen. I didn't even want it to happen. You must understand that. It just did. I knew I meant nothing to him, and how it hurt." She drew a long, lingering breath. "But I thought he would never love me. I hadn't a chance. He wasn't interested in me as a person, as a woman, or as anything, apart from as a secretary. I thought of getting another job. His indifference hurt that much. I thought of going to work for someone else and of never seeing him again, but I couldn't." She lifted her head to look at Blake. She said a little defiantly, "That was when I wrote 6 Pillows to Midnight. That was when I let out all my tears and fears and frustrations spill out on paper." She shrugged. "Of course, I didn't tell John that I'd written a book. I didn't tell anybody. For a long time, I didn't think I was going to do anything with it. It lay in a drawer in my flat, gathering dust. I'd written it, and I'd put it down on paper exactly what I felt, and that was enough." She moved her hands in a gesture. "Then one day I was in a more miserable mood than ever. Something went wrong at work, and John was very short with me. Looking back now, I can see it all amounted to nothing, but at the time it seemed as if he actually hated me. I felt that I could never have him, and that I had to do something. I had to fill my mind with something. That was when I sent the manuscript off to Harvey Innes." "But why to him?" Blake was interested. "And all right, you'd written the book under a pseudonym, but why didn't you let Harvey know who you were? Why the secrecy? Above all, why didn't you tell Harvey that you only wanted advice? You didn't want him to place the novel?" Carla sighed. "It's hard to explain. I was thoroughly mixed up in my mind. I wanted to do something positive, and at the same time I wanted an opportunity to think things out. That's why I didn't let Harvey know who I really was. And it's also the reason I told him I only wanted advice. As for why I went to him rather than any other agent, well, the reason for that was simply I knew that he was not an agent who dealt with our firm regularly. When I'd got things sorted out in my mind, I could go to him and discuss my book with him, I thought, in perfect safety. John would never know. But instead of that, Innes jumped the gun and offered the book to John," Blake said. "The book came back to your own firm." Carla nodded. "And what made matters worse was that John had just shown the first positive signs of interest in me. He'd apologised for being short with me that day, and he'd taken me out to dinner. I found that out. I mattered to him, and I couldn't forget that he hated women authors. So you didn't tell him that you were MacDonald Hall and that you couldn't go near Harvey Innes. Harvey had been to the office several times by then, Carla said, and he knew I was working as John's secretary. If I'd told him that I was the author of 6 Pillows to Midnight, I'm sure he couldn't have kept it to himself. John would have found out. Blake nodded. I see. And then, Carla said, so far as being honest with John was concerned, things went from bad to worse. He fell in love with me, hard, and to tell him then was completely out of the question. But don't think that I didn't try. I tried more than once. But always, just as I was about to take the plunge, he'd say something cutting and cruel about women writers and Carla's voice faltered. Blake said gently, I know. Carla gestured emptily. So there you are. What could I do? Her voice was defiant. I would never have said anything at all. Anyone could have claimed the damned book. I was going to be married to John and I was happy. That was before these murders, and before I came in through that door and found you here, but now... She broke off. She said in a choked voice, what will happen to me now? John will hate me. I don't think so, Blake said. He touched her shoulder. He gripped it hard. The pressure steadied her. He went on. I think everyone is going to be all right. But you mustn't tell anyone else what you've just told me, not even John, until I tell you to, understand? As if I would. Good, Blake said. It might be dangerous if anyone else knew. Dangerous to you. He turned to leave and then stopped. He said, I came in here to see if I could find anything which would prove that you were MacDonald Hall. I was sure that you were, but I had no positive proof. How did you know? Kirby gave me the hint without realizing it, Blake said. He told me 3 things, and they added up. He looked at her. I hadn't time to find out what I was searching for before you arrived, so I just bluffed it out, but I take it you have proof of some sort to back up what you've told me. I've got a carbon copy of the manuscript of 6 Pillows to Midnight, if that's what you mean. It's here. She pulled open a drawer in the dressing table and showed it to him. He nodded. Take care of it. Keep it safe. She joined him at the door. I must do something about my face. Go and bathe your eyes and then come back here and have a little rest. You'll feel better. She nodded. She put a hand on his arm. She said, I know you're trying to help me. She couldn't say any more. She had to leave hurriedly. Her eyes had filled with tears.